Hi, welcome to today's webinar. It's part of the KaiNexus Continuous Improvement series. It's titled Enterprise Excellence is Inclusive Excellence. I'm your host and moderator, Mark Graban, a senior advisor with KaiNexus. I'm really thrilled that we're joined by our presenter today, Dr. William Harvey. You'll learn more about him in a minute. I think we're in store for a really thought-provoking and engaging session, and we'll have an opportunity to do Q&A and discussion at the end. Real quickly, if this is your first time attending a KaiNexus webinar, and you might wonder, well, who is KaiNexus? We do these webinars as a service to our customers and our broader community. We are a software company. We have an enterprise software platform that helps people fulfill their purpose and our purpose of spreading continuous improvement. So if you'd like to learn more about what we do and the problems we solve, go to kainexus.com, or you can scan the QR code that's on the screen right there. Okay, so let me introduce today's presenter, Dr. William Harvey. He is an experienced operations leader. He has extensive experience in chemical processing, manufacturing, and operations management. At Michelman, he currently oversees multiple sites, leading teams in strategic planning and coaching and practicing continuous improvement. William is set to start his 8th year of teaching at the University of Cincinnati, where he teaches marketing, finance, and management. William holds various certifications in change management, quality, leadership, operational excellence, team building, and the DISC model, among others, and a doctor of educational leaderships. And I will turn things over to you. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Mark. So welcome, everybody. Excited to join Mark and the KaiNexus team today for what I think is a really engaging discussion. And I want to go right out of the gate talking about what do I mean by inclusive excellence and enterprise excellence. And it really starts with this idea that to get the best of our organizations, we need to include everybody in the process. This is less of a conversation about some of the divisive topics of today, but rather how do you engage everyone's creativity by including everyone? So what's near and dear to me as both an instructor and an operations leader is how do you get the best out of all of our teams? So I go back to really one of the things that really stuck with me is partnering with Tracy Richardson and Ernie Richardson some years ago, the authors of the Toyota engagement equation. And part of their model is this idea about E3, or everybody, every day engaged. So that's really where this place comes from, where I reflect on those experiences and say, how do you create an organization that actually does that? Many people will reference Toyota as a great model, which is where both Tracy and Ernie worked for many years. And I think about some of the organizations I've worked at, some things that did that really well and some things that didn't do that so well. So when I talk inclusive excellence, it's really about engaging everybody every day. So for me, I take that everybody every day engaged from Tracy and Ernie and turn it into a verb for me, which is how do I go about engaging everybody every day in my work, particularly my leader standard work, by asking questions and getting people to come up with their own ideas. Because the basic belief I hold is that I may have an answer, but there may be a better one. So the only way to know that there's a potential better answer is to ask a question, not tell people what I think is the best answer. And through that, we'll be able to explore this in a few different areas. These are not actually page numbers as much as they are minutes to keep me on track as we go through this today. So I just want to share, as you're looking at those, they won't relate if you've already downloaded the slides one for one. But what I do want to talk about is why the business case is not what you want in an organization when you talk about this work, and why you should just trash it because it's not working. Then I want to talk through a few lessons from the U.S. military. So if you're in the U.S. military and you have served, I just invite you to put that in the chat window just so I can see who's out there. There are no comments, good or bad, about any of the specific branches, but there is some playful stuff that go back and forth. So if I make any of those comments, just know they're all in love, particularly if they're outside the Marine Corps, which is where I served. And then I want to switch gears to some of the things that have been life lessons for me, where we talk about certifications, belts, and T-shirts, about how some of those actually hurt us. And then talk about some of the language that I've both used and have heard that does create a place where people aren't bringing their full selves to work and sharing their ideas. And then something I stumbled upon a few years ago that I think just makes the world a much better place, which is 3 things to increase engagement. And this, to me, is really where I want to end, and something that I would share in advance. If you haven't followed Mark's work, talks a lot about psychological safety, and that's really where I'm going to end, and talking about, are people actually doing the things you want to get to where you want to be? Because another basic paradigm I hold is it's not only important for leaders to create a safe environment in the sense of physical, but a mental one as well. So if we're not actually having people challenge the status quo, then I would say we're not doing our best work. And that really invites me and many others to go back to that and say, why isn't that coming out? Why aren't people speaking up? So really end with that. And I'm hopeful a robust Q&A dialogue through some of your personal experiences, as well as some of the comments around these life experiences. At no point am I going to go through this slide to say you should do something. This has come out a few times. What I'm asking you to do is question whether or not you're engaging everybody every day in the way that you want to. If you're not, consider the systems and structures you have in place. Otherwise, you may not get anything that you're really after to the full benefit. With that, I want to talk about what I hear nearly every time I hear DEI brought up. You'll see something like this. If we had a DEIA program, which I'm going to say is diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, you can also see it with a B for belonging. There's a bunch of different ways to describe it, but it's essentially intentional efforts to include everybody. And organizations that don't have that, I'll put at the index of 1. And then you'll see things like we're going to make twice as much money, we're going to be higher performing, we're going to be way more innovative and agile, and we're going to get better business outcomes. And that's all true. The challenge is when people hear this language, it doesn't resonate the way that we think. So if I think about how people are motivated, right, there is logic to this, but there's an ethical argument, and there's also just an emotional argument about why should I want to include everyone? Why do I want to be included? And one of the things that I reflect on in my youth was something really damaging to a best friend who lost a friend who died by suicide. And that's one of those things that sat with me. And I say, how do you actually engage everybody every day so those type of situations don't occur? And as I reflect on that work, that I've been doing the last 20 years, in that instance back in high school, it really resonates and say, this is way more than just sitting here trying to figure out which of the financial targets do we hit. So I ground you in that because it's way more than simply just saying this is what we should do from a business logic perspective. And that's what I want to explore next with you. There's really 3 ways to approach this. I could simply say DEIA, or diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, is the right thing to do. I could attempt to justify it by saying it's the fair thing to do, and then I can share that it's good for business. Most folks will do it's good for business, and that's true. The challenge is the fair thing to do creates an ethical argument I don't really need to have. So your best bet is not the good for business argument or the fair thing to do argument. It's actually just saying it's the right thing to do. So am I intentional as a leader to involve everybody every day? If I am doing that, then I'm doing good work, or attempting to do good work, I should say. And that is really what I want to leave you with. So when you hear these, I would just ask, how do you feel when you hear it's good for business? As a US veteran, I'm often put in this category, particularly as a Marine, that all Marines do is get around and scream and yell. Yet the reality isn't anything like that in the Marine Corps experience. It is true in the beginning, but it's not once you get beyond the basic training. And I think this is something really important because even as a veteran and a disabled veteran, I get put in these groups. And what ends up being the case in the good for business is I become a token to that group. And it's like William speak for all disabled veterans. I'm not in a place to do that, and I may not want to. So I think it's important as we're engaging folks, make sure they want to be engaged, but also know that sometimes when we compartmentalize what we are or the things we represent, it does create some challenge. It really just results in I want to be included because I want to be included, not for any other reason. Simply show up and I want to contribute to the team. And for those like me who really like the logic argument, if I say the good for business as compared to the fairness case, I get less belonging, I feel more stereotyped, and I feel more interchangeable. I'm just one veteran for another veteran. I'm just one person with a degree versus another person with a degree, and however we wanted to basically fragment ourselves. In the neutral case is what is referred to as the right thing to do. I'm not even justifying it. So if I just use the neutral case, I'm more likely or less likely to be stereotyped, interchangeable, and I'll be more committed to diversity if I'm using the right thing to do language, because I'm not trying to prescribe what it is for folks. So as we think about the ways in which we approach this work, keeping in mind it's just simply the right thing to do is your best answer. Every justification of that just creates a lot of division that isn't necessary. And most folks, when I say we just want to include folks because it's the right thing to do, we'll go with that. And the research shares that. And I think as we reflect on personal experiences, it's very similar that if I just go about my business as the right thing to do, I'm much more likely to be engaged rather than be picked for who I am. So please keep that in mind as you progress through the world, because this is something that I think is not well represented in organizations as we continue to promote inclusion in the workplace. Then I want to switch gears to something from the US military, and I love this part of the conversation because I get to invoke Harry Potter because it's really relevant to my story. So if you are a Harry Potter fan, I would just ask in the chat window, could you please put what house you're in? I'll read all that in a moment. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just put no idea, and that will be great just the same. So I know how many people are hitting with this Harry Potter idea. But this goes from the lessons from the U.S. military. And I know Mark had shared early that we have some people from different parts of the world. So briefly, there are 6 branches of the service now with our cyber service group that just came about in recent years. But what ends up being true is a lot of differences even amongst the branches. So you'll find a lot of really good non-military authors out there trying to describe military culture. And I would share, even on the military side where you read these books, it's fascinating to understand that there are differences. And one that I would share just as a reflection that many people may have read is a book called Turn Your Ship Around by David Marquet. And that's a really great book. But I was fascinated by the idea senior people or senior listed people weren't at the table with the officers. It's fascinated by the idea that the youngest Marines or the junior Marines didn't get to eat first. So even amongst the U.S. military, there are a lot of differences. So my experience is all from the U.S. Marine Corps. So everything else is just hearsay or stories from other folks where they're sharing their ideas. And I think it brings us to the first one. And for those that aren't aware, the Marine Corps is the smallest of the branches. And in this sense of being the smallest, it has the unique benefit, even after 30 years of being out of the military as a Marine, you will find a group of Marines and there will be an instant connection. And this is something that's forged from the very moment you get onto the bus as you drive over to Parris Island, South Carolina for training. And it's drilled in our heads that every Marine is a rifleman. This is true for everybody that is a Marine. The first part I would share with you, rifleman, obviously not inclusive language, but beyond that, the opportunity here is really just to reflect on what this means, that our central mission is to those around us. And what this creates is a lot of inclusion, where every Marine is the same exact Marine. And whether you're junior or senior officer enlisted, it creates a sense of inclusion because when war occurs, every person is capable of being a rifleman. And at that point, it's really just sharing this is our core mission. And that to me is so important. And if you think about the language we hear in organizations, it's often we or they. It's not us. And it's one of those things where I come to decipher this from leadership perspectives of saying, well, why are you saying we? It's your team. We've got to figure this out. I think the Marine Corps epitomizes this from the sense of this one phrase, every Marine is a rifleman. It's ingrained to us. And I mean this about the general that leads as the commandant, all the way to the newest guys getting off the bus today. They're going to buy into this ethos and keep this for the rest of their lives. And where this shows up is quite a few different ways when you talk about unity. And in organizations, I don't see as much unity. I see a lot of that plant, that department, that country. So be mindful about the language we're using there because it is damaging. And this is the part where I'm hopeful Mark can share a little bit on the Harry Potter chat side. Who do we got? Do we have any Gryffindor, Hufflepuffs?
Yes, I'm in the no idea
Okay.
club. So I see a little bit of everything: Hufflepuff, Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, Slytherin.
Yeah.
Slytherin.
So yeah, I get this. I see about maybe like 30% of people, know the Harry Potter story well. And just a little bit going back to where this comes from. If you were to visit Edinburgh, Scotland, you'd see an orphanage. In this orphanage, they have 4 towers amongst the building that the author wrote about and inspired this work. But the idea of this orphanage was where they were separated just to keep the group flowing, if you will, was separated at this university, which ends up becoming Hogwarts. So these 4 classes, if you will, 4 groups of people, the Gryffindor, the Hufflepuffs, the Ravenclaws, and the Slytherins get separated. And the idea is that they're separate because of their unique individuality, and they get put in this group and say, you're similar to this group. And it highlighted something I thought was really fascinating. It was like, well, what happens when a bad thing happens? And this is the epiphany for me. This is no different, and it represents our division of plants or divisions really, really well in our organizations. In the series, there's a bad guy, name not important, because I'm not allowed to speak it if you're a Harry Potter fan. But the bad guy in this story comes across and wants to attack Hogwarts. And in the moment, as you're going through these stories, they're all unique as Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. And it's not until much later in the process that you realize the only way they're going to be successful is if they join forces. And the way that I would encourage people to reflect on this is if you're not looking at the highest level of your organization as the we are Hogwarts, rather we are Gryffindor, we are Hufflepuff, we're using bad language. And this ends up becoming very challenging when we start pitting one another for resources. or fighting others in the group when really we should be on the same page, trying to advance the mission. And I think from a Marine Corps perspective, you would see a lot of selflessness as it's drilled into us from day one, just the same. And as you get a bunch of leaders in your organization being selfless, this idea of Hogwarts being way more valuable than the ways we can divide ourselves is much more important. So as you think about the ways in which we work, the ways in which we divide ourselves, that is just hurting us. So it's important for me just to say, bring it all up. I work at Michelman. I present that as saying, we're Michelman. I work at University of Cincinnati. I work at University of Cincinnati. It's not my college. It's not the department. It's important for the right conversations, but generally, I work at the University of Cincinnati and I work at Michelman. And that's good enough for me when I think about the work we're doing. And if you haven't watched the Harry Potter series, I would just tell you it's a long, grueling, like 30 hours. So if you're ready to binge watch, that's going to be a whole weekend for you. So be careful if that's the plan. So I've shared those colors and I found this picture and I think it represents this so well to the point I'm trying to share. As you look at these 4 soldiers, and these are US Army soldiers to my knowledge based on what I can see in their uniforms, this represents some type of division. And very quickly, I can see that there's something different. I don't know anything about what they represent, but I know there's something different about their workforces and their work units. And while the Marines do have some differentiation in their uniforms, largely you can't tell one Marine from another Marine. And that's by its very nature of uniformity. And while we would think that it's good to recognizing every single person for their unique skills, those would be the ribbons that you see on these soldiers' chests. That's awesome. What I think is challenging here is when you separate these units to start saying there's a red unit, there's a green unit, there's a black unit, there's a yellow unit. It invites the question of what is the reason for the division? And what ends up happening when the groups are stressed? Do they take care of the US Army? Do they take care of the US? Or do they take care of their immediate work group? And as I reflect on that, as I see organization stress, it often becomes who is my closest group and how do I work with that group to salvage ourselves? Rather than taking a step back and looking at it from the highest level, if I ran the company or ran the university, what would be the best decision for the most of us? And I think if I put my thinking through that lens, it changes the way in which I approach inclusion at work, because it creates these ideas, which I'll get into, that are very granular and I think common for many of us, is to say, how do I take this out of my workplace? Because it's doing the same thing that you see here. It invites a question and a difference. It wouldn't be worth saying if I didn't say this, because the Marine Corps has a troubled history with integrating women in the military, particularly our combat positions. It wasn't until 2013 the US finally said, you got to figure it out, Marine Corps. You don't have a choice. And the Marine Corps leadership was charged with trying to figure this out. And there are a few courses amongst the Marine Corps that are harder than others. And I would argue from my personal experience that seeing the infantry officers course is the most grueling course you can go to as a basic course. And what ends up happening here is a lot of attrition. So not as many people make it as you might think. It's just challenging physically and mentally as Marines are being prepared to go out and lead us in battle. And as these officers went through, it became a, can other people do this? And this highlights the policy question I want to bring up. It's not good enough to just talk about it. It's not good enough to say it in the hallway. Leadership must commit to a policy and enforce that policy, whatever it looks like to you and your organization. What ends up being true, you see a lieutenant here, 24 years, that did make it through infantry officers course. She's the first woman to ever lead an infantry platoon. She's since been promoted. So it highlights these opportunities that in an organization, these traditions are challenging, break, and sometimes it takes external force, in this case, Congress, saying you got to figure it out, Marine Corps. Fortunately, since that 2013 target to say you got to figure it out, all the forces have integrated. So training is both male and female throughout the organization, and all the combat positions that I'm aware of are open to both men and women. So it highlights a huge opportunity from a policy side. And then if you are a Marine or in the military or working in an organization with lots of traditions, the argument is often made or stated that, well, we can't change who we are. We have high expectations. And I would share with you that the Marine Corps might have the highest expectations of any group to join. And there were a few points of emphasis that I think were worth talking about through this. The Marine Corps prides itself on traditions and unwavering standards. That's true. They change in the sense that we need to evolve and get better to deal with the battles we face. But ultimately, those standards are incredibly high and they're non-negotiable. Drill instructors, the officers, are very adamant about meeting that minimum standard all the time. And to me, that's incredibly helpful because everybody's treated equally in that sense. We talk about building trust by each team member meeting the standard. And this is perhaps the most beautiful thing about all of the Marine Corps, that I encourage people to go look at how the Marines train their people. And I imagine if I asked all leaders, do you have to hold your team accountable, or is it coming peer to peer? It's often I hold my team accountable, not the peers. Marine Corps does such a phenomenal job about how they set goals, how they train their teams, that the peer-to-peer accountability is the main driver in behaviors. It's rare that it needs to get escalated to a senior leader in most instances, simply because the peers have already handled whatever the issue is, because we know the standard, we expect others to meet that standard. And then when we talk about cohesion, this is a term that many people may know as camaraderie or unit cohesion. This idea is we work together, and that is predicated upon us meeting the standard. So I think it's really important to know that if you go inclusive in your practices, you can keep the same standards and maintain those forevermore. And I think that's something that is lost in translation when organizations start to say, well, I'm going to do this work, we're going to have to give something up. I would say quite the opposite is true. And the question should be, how do I include everyone and keep the same standard or raise it? That's a much better question to ask than the other way of going, well, how do I lower the standards because, and I start to put my reasoning in why a Marine can't get into the military and lead an infantry platoon. Because the reality for me is I just want people to be able to shoot straight and downrange. I don't care about the rest of the stuff at the moment. So it's one of those things like, if Marina can do this, she is just as welcome in my group as any other Marine Corps group. And I think there's a lot to be shared with from the Marine Corps training perspective that is valuable to lots of folks. The one that I can't emphasize enough is, in the Marine Corps, there was never a goal that you were given that you can complete alone. In corporate America, I find that that's commonly the case, where I can complete it alone, and it creates a division already. So as we're starting to think about how we set goals, how do you only set team goals? Challenge yourself for that for 2025, and reflect on the differences after the experiment and say, is it working better or not when it comes to unit cohesion? Then I'm going to switch gears to probably the most divisive part of my talk, Mark. So here's where I say get rid of belts because they create unnecessary division. Get rid of certifications because they create unnecessary division. So when I'm interviewing folks and it's all about the belts and the certifications, I share with them, well, what's the purpose? As I reflect back on a question I asked Tracy and Ernie not so long ago was, what kind of belt system did you have at Toyota when you worked there? And they said they didn't have one. I saw that's pretty interesting. I'm like, the group we always espouse in continuous improvement doesn't even have their own belt system. And I got to thinking, like, what are the people actually doing? And then I take this out of the Toyota Kata work from Mike Rother. There's a practitioner and there's a coach, or a learner and a practitioner. And ultimately, it led me to this idea that the better language is not a belt system where people reach a place and they stop practicing. It's a place where you just say, I'm going to practice forever. And if I'm lucky enough and I want to coach, I'm going to go coach others that are practicing the work. And as a full transparency, as I was partnering with Tracy and Ernie on this training, I went to training to see what I might pick up new. And if you haven't followed Tracy and Ernie Richardson online, please do. They're worth following. And some of the stories out of their book just blew me away, particularly as they were shared verbally. And this idea that you just continuously be a lifelong learner, I thought I was doing okay at, but I even tricked myself. And I went to just the coach mode because I was good at it and it was easy to do. So then, from that chat, for call it 5 years now, it's been rededicating myself to practicing, not simply just trying to coach. So the language I would substitute rather than white belt and yellow belt and green belt and black belt is coach, practitioner, and practitioner. Either you're doing the work or you're coaching others to do the work and doing the work at the same time. And I think in this way, it creates a much different world in which we're focused on going out and doing the good work every day that meets our organizational needs. So if you got belt systems, I'd encourage you, just probably not telling you, encouraging you to try something without a belt system to see if it actually works better. The reason I say this is because years ago, when I was first introduced to lean in the formal way, I wanted to become trained as a black belt. And I remember going to my plant manager and he said, well, we've already sent the 2 people this year. You have to wait till next year. And I remember how stupid that was. I was like, I want to improve now and get better now so I can help the organization now. So we don't have enough seats to train you. So you have to wait. And that sat with me for a long time. And I thought, that is the craziest thing ever. I have to wait to improve my business. And I would ask you to think about your own programs. Do you have a wait list? Are you rejecting people? Because if you are, you're certainly not including everyone as fast as you could. Then asking, are these systems that we create for certifications and belts actually getting us what we want? And then I would say one of the most painful conversations I'd have with a person was one of the ones that I didn't even reflect on. And this is I say all too common thing. When I practiced continuous improvement with teams, we would create one of the agenda items, like go create a team name, and you're going to give everybody t-shirts. So we went about doing this. And I thought we were doing a great thing. You're marketing really, really well. And one of my dear friends comes to me and says, William, did you know over the last few years, you've given out hundreds of shirts, which is true. And he said, my group has never been given a single company team shirt. And I thought, well, that's crazy to me. And as I started to explore that, he said, I don't feel like I'm part of the team because I don't have a t-shirt. And I could sit there and get mad and say, well, why does the t-shirt matter? But the reality was this guy didn't have a t-shirt and he wasn't part of the group. So it became a very important lesson for me. When I talked about the Marine Corps, every Marine is a rifleman, where we just say we're Marines, it's the same idea here. So we're just Michaelmen, we're just University of Cincinnati, leaving out all the other stuff. And I remember being envious that I didn't have a black belt jacket. I remember being envious I didn't have one from Plant 2 or Plant 3 like my coworkers did. They created this part. I was like, am I part of that team or not? And it was certainly unintentional, but it created this piece for me, or this awareness of saying, I got to do a much better job. And that friend today is one of those guys I look back to and say, thank you for helping me learn this lesson, because it wasn't one I was even aware of. So as you're thinking about your next company purchase for t-shirts, consider just getting it with your company name on it and keeping it that way forever, ever more. I mean, I'd say reflect on your own experience and seeing who has the jacket, who's talking about getting a t-shirt, because it certainly came out that I need to do a much better job as a leader to make sure everybody was included. I mean, it comes out of something as a simple lesson as a t-shirt. So one that I'll carry with me forevermore and only get these. And then just as a comment for practice, I think it's a best practice, but when you hire somebody new, and you have their t-shirt waiting for them or the polo shirt waiting for them with the company name on it. Because the organizations I've worked, I've been fortunate where we'll have a bunch of company logos and branded gear, yet the new guy doesn't get any. So it's like, how do you make that new person feel welcome right away from day one, have the gear that they can be included? And then there's this idea that if I haven't shared enough to inspire you to include everybody, this is a stat that I just can't get over. I mentioned my friend earlier who had a friend who committed suicide. And it was one of those things I started reflecting on, particularly in the news in the last couple of weeks, with Memorial Day being Monday in the US, and then the incident over the weekend with a professional golfer. Maybe the work we're doing is good enough for work, but I have an argument that it's actually better for society as a whole. So as we start thinking about this work that we're doing, I think it extends well beyond the workplace. In the instance of my youth, it's one of those things that say, man, that lesson stuck with me. The professional golfer from last week sticks with me. The number of times I get on the news and find, or not news, but on social media to find a friend didn't make it through the post-traumatic stress disorder, right? It's one of those things that's very real. So this inclusion piece for me goes way beyond the idea of what are we doing at work. And if you're not aware and you need to talk to somebody, you can call 988 in the US. I know there's some global folks that I don't have good information for right now, but please call them, talk to somebody, because they're out there and they are listening. And I say this in a lesson where I both said the thing and I've heard the thing said. So if I were to pull the group right now and ask you, what are your most important holidays? You might say Halloween. You might say Independence Day. You might say Ramadan. Or you might say Christmas. And I remember one time, at least thankfully it was in a small group, but I said, we're talking about the important holidays. And I very quickly realized, oh my God, I can't believe I just said that. I just said something that was important to me, not important to somebody else, not realizing this language was so damning to the person I just may have offended, because I don't know enough about specific holidays, talking about those from my perspective. So I found out quickly as I heard those words come out, I quickly pulled the leader aside and say, hey, Mark, please just be aware of that language, right? We shouldn't use that language, and here's why. We need to be very mindful about the language we associate with these types of holidays. And I started thinking about this some more. I was like, what are some of the other dumb things I've either said or heard from others? And there's 4 that I would share with you that just blow me away. So years ago, you might hear somebody say, that is so gay. I realized very quickly that's not appropriate. We shouldn't say it. We've got better words. That is retarded, not appropriate. There's better words. No one here is disabled. Just look. These are all things people say. Or I know you have kids to care for. These things are assumptions we make about people or exclude other groups. And as I've learned a lot in the last few years, it's not what you don't say, it's what you should say. So I find this acronym that you see on the right side of the screen very helpful for me. Is what I'm getting ready to say true, helpful, inspiring, necessary, and or kind? If I can answer yes to those questions, I should say it. If it's not, then I should probably not say it. But I think as leadership language, it's got to be something that we go through, really consider what it is we're saying and how we're unintentionally excluding or intentionally excluding people when we say these words. And I think for the people that commit themselves to this, right, there are going to be gaffes when you make the mistake and use the word sometime later. So just give yourself grace, because it'll maybe years before I use the R word, but I haven't got rid of it yet. But it's been some number of years since I last used it in a bad way. I think it's really important because you don't know who you're talking to. You don't know the weight it carries with people. I would just say, really, we need to do better with the words we choose to use. I want to switch gears to this idea of engaging people every day. And in this conversation, it comes out of some work that many of you might be familiar with. If you've ever had an engagement survey at work, we talk about how do you engage everyone. And the idea is you get some score that would tell you how well you're doing relative to a group of people, or a group of companies, I should say. And I couldn't accept at the very surface level that there was some number that would tell me how well we were doing. So I asked questions, and I kept digging in and digging in and digging in. And I came across some work that really underlines a lot of what we see as engagement work today around this guy, an author named Kahn. And Kahn wrote about this idea that 3 things need to be true to engage somebody. The first of which is the work meaningful for me to complete? Meaningful for the person to complete needs to be both a here and now, as well as a future state conversation. So if my manager were to assign me a task I don't find as meaningful, I'm less likely to be engaged. I may do the work, but I'm not necessarily as committed as I would otherwise be if I didn't say, this is exactly where I want to be in my career doing this type of work. And is it safe to be my real self, or will I face consequences? This invites that discussion of psychological safety I started with at the beginning, and we'll go to toward the very end. The idea of safety here, it's also about psychological safety, but it's also about this idea of, can I just show up and be who I am? And this isn't about being reckless and, let's say, ignorant to the ways that society works, but rather, is this actually who I want to be when I show up to work? If I don't have that, I would argue that physical safety isn't enough. It needs to be psychological as well. And those consequences could be, I would say, very obvious that I'm excluded from a group, or they could be less obvious, like I don't get selected for promotions, but I can never really pinpoint what it is. And then the other part of this that I think many people are stressed by at times is, do I have the availability and health to do this work? I think this is a fascinating point, because it's not just availability as in time, but do I have the health? And as I think about those times where I've been ill, or somebody in my family has been ill, my mind's gone elsewhere. And I think as we start thinking about our work, and at least the way I've framed this question to folks is there a time where you weren't engaged, where one of these 3 wasn't true? And to date, nobody's been able to say, no, it wasn't any of those 3. So I think this researcher has found some really good work that is insightful and can take us forward into exploring how do you engage everybody every day. And if you haven't read that work, I encourage you to do so, because there is some really good, I would say, nuggets coming out of that from Kahn's work from 1990. And then I love this idea, and I'm going to invoke a friend of Mark and me. Her name is Deandra Wardell. I'm hopeful she's listening today. Deandra does some amazing work. And then I'm going to invoke Mike Roth, who talks about deliberate practice in his Toyota Kata work. So I started thinking about these ideas of inclusion and being deliberate, and then I just jammed them together. This may exist, but for me, it was a thing I started to think about. I was like, how do you actually do this? Because I can't just say, don't do bad things. So I think about all of the things that I've shared in these slides and say, here are the 4 things that really make sense to me. Is setting clear objectives. This does come from leadership. It does come from policy and saying, what it is we're trying to achieve. Now, I work at 2 organizations that are doing some really good work in the DEIA space. And I think it's fascinating to watch as we grow women in our leadership roles, as we start to expand our recruiting searches beyond the universities that only hire white people. So there's a lot of this work that you've got to, I would say, look at and say, what am I really doing when I go to these organizations and recruit folks to the organization? And then I got to focus my efforts, because I would tell you, in talking with our DEI team at Michelman, there's so much you could do. The one thing that I think is really cool about our executive leadership team and our DEI team has been that they've been able to focus to a few critical things. So now we know what we're trying to do. And the team's doing an awesome job of going back and getting feedback early and often. And this early and often piece is being out, we're talking to folks. It's well represented by 10 team members across the 250 population in the US, and then ultimately making consequences known. I think for most people, they'll understand how the universities work and that you must follow certain rules because they're just legally required. So the consequences are very obvious. In organizations that are not governed by federal funds, it's a little bit different. But equally, at my organization, Michelman, we know the consequences if you don't follow these things and we don't respect people. I mean, we build them into our values, but we say, how do you be deliberately inclusive? And one thing that sat with me extremely well, I was with Deandra at one of her sessions, and she said, I always go out and see people who look like me. Now, I'm not sure if Deandra would say she's African American or Black, but she is an African American woman to me. That's how I've heard her describe herself at some level. So she goes out, she finds people just like her. So I'd say in this deliberate inclusion, if you get to go to any of these really awesome conventions around the world, can you be deliberately inclusive and go find people that look like they're standing on the outskirts? Invite them in for a conversation. And just as a comment, over the last 2 years at the Association for Manufacturing Excellence, I made 90 new connections in about 8 days worth of time. Met lots of amazing people. And this is one that I think was a really fascinating conversation starter. Most people I hear, they'll talk about work, and that's the most common thing I hear about conventions. But then I said, when you're not doing this work thing, what are your favorite hobbies? I found out last year, 3 random people all love to collect antiques. And I imagine that conversation didn't come out anywhere else. But it invited a good 35-minute conversation with that group of 3, simply because the question I asked was different and it includes that person in the conversation. And I think as you're starting to think about some of this work, it's like, how can I change my behaviors to be deliberately inclusive? So please do give that some consideration. And before I get to turn it over to Mark for Q&A, I want to end with something I think that's near and dear to both of us in the idea of psychological safety. If you're not following Mark on the internet and a lot of the social media forums that he's in, please do reach out to him because he's posting articles commonly and quite often on psychological safety. And there's a gentleman that wants to, or shares that the idea goes through these 4 stages. And across, from left to right, you would say, include me simply because I'm human. Just like you, I want to get better, so help me learn. Just like everybody I know, I want to make a difference too, so invite me to contribute. And lastly, this is where I really think we need to spend our time. If you don't hear disagreement, you haven't done enough work to include everybody. And that last bit about helping me feel safe is also just as important as being safe at work for me. So if you're not physically safe, you're not psychologically safe, it does create the opportunity that I don't get as much out of people as they would otherwise present to themselves. And as we think about psychological safety, you can read in a lot of this, but I really just ask you to think through these 4 lenses. Do I include everybody? Do I help everybody learn every chance I get? Do I ask folks to contribute? And do I welcome disagreement when it comes to challenging the status quo? I think for me, I felt really good about the first 2. I spent probably 15 years working on level 3. And I won't necessarily say I'm to level 4 by any stretch, but that's one of those ones I say, I've got to let go of some of these things to invite people to contribute. And ultimately, when you hear disagreement, how does leadership respond? Is it in harshness? Is it in disagreement that I just don't like your idea? Or is it really listening to understand what the person's sharing? And with that, Mark, I'd like to turn it over to you for questions.
All right, William, thanks so much. I'll just say a few words, let people scan the QR code if they want to do that before making a few announcements. Thank you for the presentation, and I encourage people to continue submitting questions using the Q&A. I'll give William a chance to catch his breath and have some water. Not that that was a breathless presentation, but still, give you a break here. If you could advance it, please. Got a big old TBD in the space that normally shares the next webinar. If you've registered, well, you did register for this webinar, we'll send you an email about future webinars. If you are watching the recording of this, you can go to kainexus.com/webinars and sign up to be notified via email about future webinars. We do these about once a month. And in the meantime, you can always go check out the Webinars on Demand library, more than 100 webinars, lots of topics, all continuous improvement and leadership and culture related. So if you go to kainexus.com/webinars, click on the right-hand side where it says Webinars on Demand. Those are all there. And they are also can be found in our YouTube channel if you search KaiNexus. Next slide. And we invite you check out other free resources that we make available for customers and our broader community. We have a blog.kainexus.com. There's great content on there every week. Next, we also have the KaiNexus podcast that's available. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts is going away, so I'll have to update the slides, but it'll be available Spotify, pretty much anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can subscribe, you can listen. The audio of today's session will be available there. Lots to listen to on the podcast. We hope you'll check that out. Next, and your feedback matters. We've learned, so at the end of the webinar, you'll get a pop-up. There'll be a thing in your browser inviting you to fill out a short survey. We learned we got a better response rate when we more explicitly made this appeal to please do click on that. Sometimes, we get asked for surveys all the time, every day, and we really do read all of the responses. That includes feedback on today's session, ideas for future webinars. We really do encourage you to take a couple of minutes, please, and fill out that survey. We do appreciate it. And with that, we'll open things up for Q&A. And you can see William's email address there on screen if you'd like to reach out to him. We've got a lot of questions, William. There's one here from Fortune. There's so much corporate and political pushback against inclusion now. Do you have thoughts, suggestions on how to handle that?
I do, and this goes to the policy question. It's an uncomfortable space to be. So I'd say unless there's legislation at the state level prohibiting you from doing certain work, it's going to, in my opinion, involve the senior leadership team or executive leadership team at your organization or any organization. That policy does need to come from leadership. And I think it's one of the more challenging things because I think oftentimes we want it to just be easy. But without that direction from leadership, it's been a near, I'd say, impossible challenge to overcome. And I just think about some of the challenges of the last few years when you think about monuments that have come down throughout the US, particularly as we look at them on college campuses. It's like, well, how do you balance free speech and this idea that we don't want these monuments? And one of the leaders of Northern Kentucky University had to deal with this very situation. And really, it came down to that conversation of, sometimes we need to set policy, but we need to do it with folks. I don't think people resist DEIA. I think people resist the idea that they have to do something different or are compelled. So I think it's important to hear all sides of the discussion. So I think it's involving a very cross-functional and very diverse group in their thought to actually help set this policy. So that's the guidance I would share, and not just go to what I would say are the typical DEI components where we only compartmentalize. Because as a veteran, I would argue I am in a minoritized status. So when people speak for me that don't know veterans, it's like, well, I feel really left out. So like, could you ask me how I feel? Because nice. So I think it just needs a more expansive view of what does it actually look like. And in lots of cases, it's less about what not to do, but what we will do. So I think it's about the language we use. And I have attempted, at least in this presentation, to make sure the language was, here's something we could go do, not don't go do it. And I think that's important from the DI policy is what do we want to see in good behaviors across organization?
Yeah. Thank you, William. I'm curious if you have some thoughts about breaking down barriers so that we can identify as, I'll look from a KaiNexus standpoint, I don't think this is a problem, but I'm a KaiNexian. I'm wearing a shirt that says KaiNexus. We have teams and departments within KaiNexus, and again, not saying there's a problem, but that can be a challenge in different companies. What advice would you have, whether it's directed at us or other companies, about kind of breaking down the barriers to identifying at that high level? And again, not a problem here, but it's a problem in a lot of companies where incentive compensation or measures really get in the way of that identification and teamwork.
Yeah, excellent question with quite a few different ways to approach that. I would start by saying the organization is a system. And I think the first opportunity is looking at the reward structure as a whole. And this is one I challenged in a good way, challenged in conversation and thought. Most incentive comp is only about what you do this year, not necessarily what's good for the long term for the whole. So I think the challenge it creates is some unnecessary or unintentional division amongst those groups. So not at KaiNexus, but I believe it's true at many organizations. And the way that I think that works is to just do something as simple as setting team goals. So if incentive comp is something you're hell bent on doing in your organization, it's like, well, make sure every compensation for incentives is based on a team achievement. And the way that I've seen this work perhaps the best, I would just encourage people to go look at Nucor Steel if they haven't yet. If I had a plant in Cincinnati and there was something down in Arkansas, my bonus was predicated on me getting to Arkansas to help get that plant running. And if you look at Nucor Steel's performance, it's been phenomenal over the last, call it 30 years. And that's something different, but it's very similar to the way that I experienced the Marine Corps, that there was always a team-based goal. So I don't think the challenge is incentive comp. I think it's challenged by me getting a goal that's different from Mark, that's different from the next person. And that's where I think the opportunity lies. So I think going back to team goals is probably the best bet.
Yeah. But then if different team goals within the company are not aligned, I mean, team, we at some point need to step back and say, okay, well, are these company goals?
Yes. And yeah, I think to that point, Mark, to take it that step further, one of the things I forget to realize is that I think through that at the idea of Hoshin from strategy to deployment and what you'd see at Toyota. So whether you're using that model, the OKRs, the OGSNs, objectives and key results, objectives, goals, strategies, and measures, there's lots of different ways that do the same thing, but ultimately it's to align it to the organization. And the reality that I've shared many times, and it's been, I would say, somewhat challenging for me because if I have a process engineer working on the 38th most important problem, but it's my most important departmental problem, I'm not actually working on the best problem for the company. So it really takes me a step back to say, really, where is the most valuable work that this person can contribute, not what's my biggest problem. And I think that takes a lot of leadership to sit there and say, okay, maybe the best thing for the company actually hurts me. But if I'm rewarded on me, then obviously my desire is to keep that engineer with me. My goal is on making the company better. I'm saying, absolutely, please, please take Mark for 6 months to do that project because that's the right thing to do for us.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Maybe next, let's go to another question here. How would one progress in the improvement world without the formal belt? You touched on this a little bit about having a coach, and maybe if you can elaborate on some of that, though.
So I think the first thing that I realized after the 20 years of doing this work, trying to get to the belts, getting the belts, is that I was trying to achieve a thing that was very concrete. And that's where I think certifications come in really well because it's like William needs to do skill A, skill B, skill C. And while that's true, the last, call it 10 years, including my research, was around the idea of just thinking about thinking. And one of the things that comes out for me with Mike Rother's Toyota Kata is exactly that. Very similar to some other methods that you might see out there, but it was the uniqueness that Rother saw at Toyota. And it was really using that scientific method. If you go back into Taiichi Ohno's work, he simply said it was a scientific method. There was nothing magical here. Just have an observation, make a hypothesis, go test something, review the results, and make your next step. So I think the way to progress is actually just to get better at learning and in this rapid experimentation. And there's a bunch of people on the web with different opinions, but one that I hold near and dear is the idea of promoting Kaizen. Kaizen is not something I do in a week. It can be, but I'd argue Kaizen should be done every day, every meeting, every opportunity you have a chance. So for me, it's reframing what it meant. And I would say I got the bad end of the stick with the certifications because I thought I needed to go do a SMED, followed up by a 5S event, and then eventually one day I'd be a black belt, not realizing maybe I never need to do a SMED at all, or why was 5S important? So I think critical thinking is the part that's most important with the idea of Kaizen. So back to what Mark had alluded to with have a coach, be a coach. So it's a common phrase in the Toyota Kata world. So to me, it's go find somebody that can help you get better at your work. And when the time is right, go coach others. Because there's a lot of value in both of those, right? I need to practice, learn myself, but I also need to practice asking questions. So if I give one bit of advice from a leadership perspective in CI, it's get better at asking questions, get better at listening. Don't get better at telling people what to do. And as I take that back, 1,000 feet, it's like, okay, that's what they were doing all along. They weren't telling anybody anything. They were simply asking questions to involve or invoke creativity. And to me, that's the beauty of advancing in CI.
Yeah, I mean, there's learning, which can be done in many ways through webinars, books, podcasts, online courses. And I think some of it depends, if you're talking about progressing, does that mean progressing in your company? Toyota doesn't require the belts. So, I mean, you progress through the company and the ways people are evaluated there. I'm going to share a quick example when you talk about exclusionary CI practices, William. 20 years ago, I worked for a manufacturing company that had Six Sigma belts of all levels, including Master Black Belt. On the lean side of things, because they didn't view it as a Lean Six Sigma certification, it was Six Sigma or Lean. They didn't call the lean stuff belts, but it was almost worse. Instead of a lean black belt, I had on my business card and I got certified as a lean expert. And then the level above, instead of master black belt, was lean master. And I pleaded, could I please put anything else on my business card? And they said no because of standards. And I Like, all right, I'm not going to hand those business cards out. It's embarrassing. It sends a really bad message. So yeah, I see you chuckling. I'm just curious if you want to pile on with your reactions to calling people experts.
It's similar to what my life experience was. I didn't have the same exact thing because I worked in system or organizations at the belts. But what it did for me was frame the conversation that I made it. And I think that's the most damaging part.
Right.
When I got to master black belt, I was like, well, now I can teach this. And I was doing that. But the thing I stopped doing was being the learner. And I look back to that Tracy and Ernie training some years ago, and I thought, I'm so glad I came to this. Took away a few lessons, but one of those was like, just rededicate yourself every day to practicing Kaizen. Go out and help your team learn, ask questions, grow, figure out the safety issues, the quality issues. So for me, I don't get a lot of value out of the belts. Initially, I did because I thought that's what I needed to do.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's just like, what do you want to do? I was like, I just want to help Mark out with his work today. Like, that's it. My goal is to go help Mark do something better,
Mm-hmm.
or at least experiment that way. And I think that is much more fulfilling because it became inward. I think the black belts and the master black belts are good when I hand out a business card. But the reality is, I'd rather just make the team I work with every day their work better, and
Mm-hmm.
that's much more appeasing than somebody being happy that I got a certification.
Yeah, and I'm not being dismissive of learning. Right, if somebody learns through an online belt program class, that's great. But I think the value is in the learning and the doing, where framing things as experiments, practice. I love the phrase practicing lean. Doctors get to say they're practicing medicine. I think we could all say we're practicing continuous improvement, which hopefully means getting better, reflecting through PDSA cycles, learning from our mistakes. And I think another element of being able to learn from mistakes comes back to psychological safety. So we had a question come in about that. I'll let you chime in first, William. I might have a couple thoughts to share too. But how do you balance psychological safety and accountability?
I think this goes into one that I was sharing with the team yesterday, and it's that we don't involve people early enough.
Mm-hmm.
So as I've seen this graphic shared with the PDSA cycle, we spend most of our time in the doing, very little in the planning phase. Perhaps we get to study and adjust, but often that's optional in organizations. So I think the first and most important piece is to involve people in setting those standards for their work. And that, I think, is so simple said, but rarely executed because we just commit to things without talking to folks. So I think the way to engage accountability and psychological safety is to have that conversation. Hey, Mark, the goal is to get to X. How long do you think it's going to take to X? And then hold that standard from an accountability perspective. This is Mark's words, not necessarily mine. As long as that meets our organizational need. If it doesn't, then it's like, okay, Mark, what would we need to do it in half that time?
Mm-hmm.
I need 5 resources. And my job as a leader is to go get those resources for Mark if that's really a business priority. And that's how I'm balancing safe or psychological safety and the idea of accountability. This
Mm-hmm.
one I say is maybe a little bit more natural for me. So I invite you to share some of your experience, Mark, to where that might fit better.
Yeah. I see. I would frame the question a little differently. I don't think psychological safety and accountability are something we balance, because I don't think those are diametrically opposed any more than we would have to balance flow and quality, or safety and profitability. Those things can go hand in hand. They're sometimes viewed as a trade-off. Psychological safety can be defined as, do you feel safe speaking up and being candid when you feel like you want to or need to? That's a different dimension than accountability. So sometimes people use different definitions of psychological safety. It doesn't mean safety from being held accountable. It doesn't mean safety from, being safe from living by workplace standards. But I think, in an environment of high psychological safety, there's the same, if not higher, level of accountability. Because if someone is not following workplace standards, a leader might, in a environment of healthy discussion, or like you said, an environment where we've defined standards together, a manager might be less afraid of being candid and giving candid feedback to the employee. The employee would feel less afraid of candidly asking questions and I point people to Tim Clark's work. He talks a lot about how, psychological safety is not freedom from accountability. We can have greater accountability within a team. And then one other thing I'll add, and I'll let you have the last word on all of this, William. I really do recommend Tim Clark's book, The Four Stages of Psychological Safety. And there's this progression. Stage one is what he calls inclusion safety. There's that word again. Are we including people in improvement? Are we including them in all of these workplace conversations? And he also uses words like acceptance and respect, right? So a lot of parallels to lean or TPS thinking, that we need that foundation or we can't get full psychological safety, including, what he calls stage 4 challenger safety. But, there's a lot of discussion in this world. You touched on it, like safe to be my real self. If my real self is a jerk and I'm disrespecting people, like there's got to be some boundaries of saying, okay, you're being your authentic self, but now you're hurting other people and you're making them feel less able to speak up. That's not what we really mean by psychological safety. So I don't know, I'm curious your thoughts on that or anything else you would want to say
I
to
think
help
that
wrap up.
I attempted, Mark, and maybe not the best way. That's the part where I was really just sharing. When you show up to work, to your point, you can't be a jerk. So I think this gets into one of the most challenging parts of this work is, do I value the collective over the individual or the individual over the collective? This invites the biggest discussion, I think, in all of our worlds. And for me, it's a very collective approach. So I recognize I want to be part of society. In order to be part of society, I can't be a jerk in certain situations. At those points, it's like, what do I need to do? Choose my words wisely. Don't comment on certain things that are inappropriate. And that's a choice I make. So for me, I like being part of society. So if somebody wants to just say, I don't want to work anywhere with people, I'm like, there's jobs maybe that exist that way. I don't know where they're at, but good luck to you. But for me, I like going to work. I like my coworkers and I want to stay with them. But I think part of it is just saying, okay, well, is this a big enough deal for me to make, or do I just let it go because it's really not that important to me as a person? And it's a value, but not one that's really worth bringing up to the workforce.
Yeah. There's a comment from Fortune in the chat. Psychological safety creates accountability. Otherwise, people hide all the mistakes and defects. They won't be honest, or, we could use the word candid. And I think part of the key here is accountability without blaming people for systemic problems and being punitive, because then that does drive problems underground.
Yes.
Well, William, you're facing all of these wonderful challenges as a leader every day. I appreciate that you were able to take time away from that to share your thoughts and insights and to challenge us all on some things. So there are a lot of comments in the chat about this being a wonderful webinar. Appreciate the insight, great conversation and webinar. So I want to thank people for that feedback. And William, thank you for the presentation today. Again, the session is being recorded if you want to revisit it or share it with colleagues. We hope you'll do that. If you have an idea for a webinar you might want to present, being a part of our KaiNexus community here, you can reach out to me, Mark at KaiNexus.com, if there's something you want to share. If you haven't done a webinar before, I'll coach you through it. I'll help you. William's an experienced presenter, but we really do want to have different voices and different perspectives here in the webinar series. So thank you to everybody for attending and staying on here through the Q&A. Thank you for joining us, and we'll hope to see you next time. Or as we say here at KaiNexus, Kai next time. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.